In this video, we're going to talk about diversity and inclusion, as D&I, and I'm super excited to have an amazing guest with me, Louise. And Louise is an expert in this field, so any questions you have, leave a comment in the below and we can chase Louise for those answers later on. But hopefully we can share lots of ideas and tips and information about the area with you because it's a really important subject. Louise, thank you so much for joining me on my YouTube channel.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Please give yourself an introduction. I don't think I did you any justice.
Well, I'm Louise. I work in diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'm a podcaster where I talk about it. My podcast is called Diversity Secrets.
And the link is in the description below. Go check it out.
Yeah, I'm an advisor and expert on those issues, specifically on diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace, in the corporate world.
Awesome. And you said diversity, equity, and inclusion. So what's the equity part?
A lot of people say just diversity and inclusion. That's kind of like the mainstream term for it, but there is also equity that fits into it. It's a bit new. Equity is about the idea of justice, and equity you can't have inclusion if you don't have equity. So basically diversity is having people well represented around the table, right? Being invited to the party, right? Then inclusion is being invited to dance when you're at the party. But in order to be invited to dance, then you need kind of like all the extra steps in the middle, to make sure that you're noticed, that you're not just in one of the corners over there. People are inviting you to actually, be at the buffet table, talk and be part of the group, and then maybe someone can invite you on the dance floor, right? So equity is everything that needs to happen for people to feel included. I can give a bunch of examples of how that can work in the workplace and stuff.
I love that. I'm glad you explained diversity and inclusion as well. That was my next question, so thank you so much for bringing it up. It's great to have a foundation so everyone has a really good understanding of what it means. And I can't wait for those examples because I think examples are such a great way. The way you explained I've heard the expression being invited to the party and then being asked to dance, but I didn't think about the part in the middle, so that's really true. So thank you so much for sharing that. So Louise, what do you do at the moment? Do you work for a company? Do you content create? Do you consult? What are you doing at the moment in the D&I space?
I'm a content creator, I guess, in the D&I space. As I said, I have my podcast, Diversity Secrets, where I basically invite experts and leading figures in the field of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and just to ask them the questions I have and that I'm also asking myself as a young professional in this field, and just get their expertise, their journey, and their D&I story as well. And with the hope of inspiring DI professionals, but also just anyone that wants to, live in a more inclusive and diverse society. So that's where I am right now. The reason why I started this podcast was because I didn't really know where I was going. Maybe I can tell you about where I'm coming from, but yeah, I didn't really know where I was going in the field of diversity, equity, and inclusion. It wasn't so clear for me. I didn't do any studies in human resources or in a business school or anything. And I just still needed to know what I wanted to do in that field. I knew that it was my passion and I knew it was something that I wanted to work on and really have an impact on, but I didn't know if I wanted to work in an organization, as a D&I manager, for instance, or if I wanted to be a consultant. Right now, I'm more moving towards consulting in the field, and my podcast is really helping me create the network I need, and also just gathering also a lot of experience, best practices that are out there, and expertise as well.
That's awesome. So I love that. And how did you get to where you are today? How did you get into D&I? What's your story and your journey to where you are today?
Obviously, there's a personal and a professional story to it. I think D&I is very personal for, anyone that's in it. I identify as a woman, and I've experienced sexism in my personal and professional life. And so that was kind of like a sense of injustice that came to me through that, and that I wanted to change for myself and for others. But then came also, as I started getting involved in feminism, I had a feminist blog for a while, and I gathered also this sense of privilege that I have as a white person. I'm part of a dominant group, and it's always been the case wherever I am and wherever I was working or studying. It's not easy to acknowledge as a person with privilege, but it's very important as part of a journey, and I think I'm still learning that, of course. On the one hand, the sense of injustice, and then on the other hand, the sense of privilege, with which came also this sense of duty, that I thought that, okay, I think I also have the privilege to be able to act on these injustices for me and for others. So that was kind of like the personal side to it. And then the professional side to it was that I'm I was far from the field of diversity, equity, and inclusion. I was interested in general interest or I guess public good, public interest, because I did study public policy, economic development, social development. So I was very much in that field of, building a public good for people. But my career started in diplomacy and in public relations. So building relationships between governments and corporations, specifically American corporations. And it's when working with these American corporations that I started working on corporate social responsibility. So the responsibility of companies to do good for our planet, for our people, for societies, everyone. And we started working on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And incidentally, I started this work, I think only like 5 to 6 months before the Black Lives Matter movement started in the US, and COVID and everything that entailed as well for corporate social responsibility in the field of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so that's where I got started.
And you must have a lot of challenges. Actually, that's one of my questions later on, but I'm quite excited to ask it now. What sort of challenges have you faced in this field? So you mentioned personally and professionally you had some challenges, but what about now that you're in this field and you're trying to educate people on the importance of diversity and inclusion? What sort of challenges have you faced? Do some people think it's not an important subject, or it's if they've got time or if they've got budget? Like, what sort of challenges do you have in that area?
For diversity and inclusion in the field of business, I think the hardest part is to be very honest about where we are, where we're going, and how we're going to do that. Being patient as well. And I think that business as it is today, just because we live in a capitalist world, patience is not a thing. We want it now, we want the results now, return on investment and everything. And D&I isn't necessarily the business speech that we're used to, we as in companies, as in also societies. And so I think the hardest part is to convince people, and also the hardest part is because, and we'll talk about this later, but sadly the people in power today are not the people that are mainly concerned by diversity, equity, and inclusion issues, and they're the people that have to take the decision. And so it's great when they get on board, but getting them on board is difficult. And then, once you have the leadership on board, you also need to get the middle management on board to make things move forward. And those people, they're paid to be at work to, manage product, business development and stuff. They don't necessarily want to hear about diversity, equity, and inclusion. That's not what they're paid for. They're just doing their day job, which is absolutely normal. But yeah, basically the hardest part is 1, patience, 2, I think accepting that we're not all at the same level of the journey, and 3, just the maturity as well in our society for these issues that's maybe not ready yet. So a lot of maybe backlash, and a lot of risk as well in business when you want to go fast, of kind of just like we have greenwashing for like environmental issues, you can also have a bit of diversity, equity, and inclusion washing, like having like, oh, here's our 8th of March Women's Day celebrations, it's like, yeah, well, what do you do the rest of the year,
Yeah.
Or here's our Black History Month, yeah, but what do you do the rest of the year,
That's a really interesting topic again, and I kind of probably jumping way ahead with my questions, but the way you talk about those I think is really important. So my next question is going to be, how can someone help? Like, how can someone be an ally? I think a lot of the time, as you mentioned, it should come from the top, but it doesn't. It comes probably more from my experience, from the bottom. People kind of saying this is important, and diversity and inclusion does help us produce better tools, better products, better teams, communication, collaboration, all that great stuff. But it's a marathon, not a sprint. It's not gonna kind of happen overnight. What can people do to maybe help? Like, how can allies help with this?
So I think as an ally, the first thing to do is to listen and just kind of put your prejudice aside or your ideas aside, just to listen and hear. Not only listen, but actually hear what people concerned have to say, right? That's also why I started the podcast, because I knew that there was a lot of things that I still needed to hear just to continue on my journey, and just to very well be aware of my own privileges, even though as a woman I have experienced some discrimination and some issues related to inclusion, but that's just a fraction of the whole problem, and that doesn't represent the experience of people of color, of women of color, of people from different social backgrounds, and very well aware of that. But it takes time to kind of take that in. And so that's, I think, the first thing that an ally can do. And anyone can be an ally, right? Like, you as a man can be my ally in terms of sexist discriminations, for instance. Me as a white person can be your ally in terms of anti-racism, for instance, right? So like, we're all allies and subjects of, discrimination in all ways, kind of. And I think that it's also important for white heterosexual men to also understand this, that the status quo doesn't necessarily, like, of course, on paper, they're kind of like on the winning team in the status quo, but the world could be so much better, even for them, if we could just make it more diverse and inclusive and just fair as well for everyone. In terms of concrete terms in the company, how to be an ally. Yeah, if you're in leadership, listen, allow for times of getting like speaking groups maybe together for those that are concerned to be able to speak. Maybe they want to do it just among people who have the same values or identity as them, or they would also like to share it with the rest of the company, for instance. It's not always easy. So that's also something to keep in mind, to know like which structures to put in place. Basically, not speak on behalf, but speak for these people, if you are in a position where your voice can make a change, in the company.
Recently, I've come across a lot of white men who say they're now a minority. What are your thoughts on this, and what do you think? Is there some truth to that? Are they just being worried because they're not center of attention anymore? What do you think? So
there's no truth to it in terms of facts and figures, right? In STEM, only, if we just take the tech area, white people represent 89% of the workforce, right? If we take men, they represent 72% of the workforce in STEM, right? So if you cross those numbers, it's not true. They're not a minority. It's true that things are changing, and diversity and inclusion, you have to think it as a huge disruption. It is a huge disruption for our society, and it is a huge disruption that's not going in the way that some people might like it, because they're part of a dominant group and they've benefited from it, right? And it does mean giving up some things, right? But as I said before, there's also a lot to gain from being in a diverse and inclusive workforce, including for white men, right? If they are saying that, it's probably because the communication is not going so well within the company or the organization where they are in. If there are, for instance, networks for, people of color in the company, or networks for women in the company, but that they feel excluded from those networks, and that there's no, I'm not saying that there should be a white male network, but there should maybe be initiatives that include everyone in the company, whether it's trainings, workshops, on cognitive biases, just so that they can also, benefit from it and understand what's happening. And when I speak about disruption, it's a huge disruption for individuals, because companies like to do trainings on cognitive biases and unconscious biases. It's good to be aware of them, but these trainings kind of give us the idea that we can get rid of them. It's not true. They're unconscious. We all have biases and we can't get rid of them, at least not once you reach the workforce. Maybe we can start when we're like 2 or 3 years old, right? But not once we're in the workforce, right? So it's good to be aware of them. And that's kind of like the psychological disruption that diversity and inclusion does to us, because you realize like, oh shoot, I didn't know that I was thinking this way, and maybe that's why I'm so upset today. And, it makes you, think in more objective terms rather than subjective terms. And in terms of systematic disruption as well, it's a huge disruption just for the structures that we live and work in, right? Because if you're going to be putting in place some diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, it means changing the way you're hiring, changing the way you're promoting, changing the way you're valuing people in your company, changing the culture as well. It means if you're in a very, male-ridden environment, banning some like bro culture environment, just because if you do want women to come work in your company, if that's the target, you can get the talent pool, you can recruit, but if they don't feel at ease coming to the office because the culture there doesn't make it comfortable for them, then it's just not going to work. And I'm talking about women right now, but it's for every underrepresented group in a company as well, yeah.
So that's great, because that dovetails into my next question. And let's take the women group at the moment as an example. you're absolutely right. It is definitely wider than that, but just for this example now. So I know in a lot of communities, a lot of companies, they have women networks or women groups. Some people think this is not a great idea. And I'm on the fence with this, and let me explain why, and you can kind of give me your thoughts and from your experience. So I love it as a safe place for them to be able to talk about and do whatever they need to do. But it also makes me think, if other people can't learn what a safe place is about for everyone, then it's kind of delaying not needing a women's only group, because then it's just, there's a group, everybody's there, it's safe for everybody. And so for example, in my EdiHub community, many times I've thought about creating a private channel for people who identify as women to be able to go in there and chat more safely. But then I thought, actually, wait a second, I want the whole of EdiHub to be safe for everybody. And that's something that myself and the community have really helped me do. And I really believe it is a safe place for everyone. So I don't think we need it. But what are your thoughts on that? Do you hope maybe in 10 or 15 years that it's not needed? As in, I've also stopped using the hashtag women in tech when referring to people I've collaborated with who do identify as women, because I think they should just be another person or people in tech, right? Why do we have to identify them as they're a woman in tech? We don't say men in tech. So I really just want tech to be for everybody. And maybe you can kind of share some of your thoughts, maybe some experiences in that area.
Yeah, I think ideally that's where we're headed to. It's just that we're not there yet, and we can't. That's what I meant by like patience and taking our time. We just can't skip the steps, I think. I think it's important to have these groups for, in that scenario, women to be able to talk among themselves and address the issues that they're facing and that they may not feel comfortable addressing in front of other coworkers. Like we think about those groups, and sometimes those groups, address very high-level issues or kind of like above the surface, oh, what about the glass ceiling? What about this and all that? But maybe in those groups, you can also address, sexual harassment at work. Would you feel comfortable doing that in front of coworkers that may be as well your harassers? We're not yet there in a space where I think we can address everything altogether, just because there's just different levels of journeys, different levels of maturity into addressing this. But having only a women's only group or an employee resource group for people of color is not going to be enough, right? And by the way, these employee resource groups, of course, they have to organize meetings for the people that identify with that identity, for instance, but they should also be organizing events, trainings, workshops for others in the workplace, right? So that they can tell them like, look, this is what we mean when we say, discrimination about this. This is what we mean about biases and prejudice about this, right? So these employee resource groups should be also inclusive of others, right? Of course, they need to work on their issues and have meetings for themselves, but they also need to be inclusive in the way that it's a burden, but that, you need to be part of the education and the learning journey of your other coworkers, right? So it can't be an exclusive initiative. It has to come with everything else, because that's what's going to change the culture in the company.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Really kind of opened my eyes a lot more as well, so that's great, thank you. So in EdiHub, we actually really encourage inclusive language, and at the beginning it was myself and other mentors and moderators saying don't use guys, maybe use folks or people. And now we've actually got a bot, we actually wrote it, so therefore it checks for non-inclusive language, and then it kind of comes up with a warning and saying maybe you want to use and suggest some alternatives. It doesn't enforce anything, doesn't kick them, ban them or anything like that. It just encourages them to use more inclusive language. And when they edit the message, the warning disappears. Do you have any other advice or tips or steps that we could do to be even more inclusive in EdiHub?
I think that's great. Like in terms of the bot, I think it's really a great initiative because the use of words is very important. Even if, in your company, even if it's just like an encouragement message going out to the team, being like, let's go get him, boys, and you're like one of the two people that doesn't identify with being a boy in the team, and you're like, well, okay, am I part of this team? So I think it's really great. That's a really great initiative. If you're looking to build awareness within your community, I think giving the mic and giving the stage as well to the people concerned is great. Just like an online event, if you want to concentrate on issues about women in tech, you can have an event where you have women coming in and talking about their experience as women in tech. Earlier I was talking about microaggressions or not feeling included or like you belong. And I think who better than them to talk about it? And it can be for any underrepresented group in tech as well.
That's great. I look forward to actioning some of those as well and taking GitHub to the next level. So what are the next steps for you, Louise? You've given us so many tips, you've shared so much about your experience, and it's been really, really helpful. But where are you going to be next? Where can we see you in the next 1, 3, or 5 years?
Whew. I'm not a big 5-year plan person. 1 year, so I hope my podcast will still be up and running. Diversity Secrets. We're actually working on the 2nd season right now. It's exciting. We're going to talk about why it matters in terms of business. So the whole business case behind diversity and inclusion. And so that's going to be really cool. And then I have other ideas for next seasons to come. I'm also looking forward to maybe monetizing the podcast so I can, live off of it a bit. And as I said, going into consulting. So I'm really learning so much. And before starting the podcast, I was also writing a lot of reports on diversity and inclusion and recommendation and toolkits for companies that I would really like to go and help them put them in place and implement them. So yeah.
That's awesome. So everyone watch this space. Check out Louise's links in the description below. We'll put your podcast in there and we'll put your Twitter in there because we're hopefully going to encourage you to be more active on Twitter because it's just a great way to connect with the community. I think it's just awesome. Thank you again so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it. You shared so much useful information. So everyone, don't forget, watch this again. You might need to, there's so many tips. I know I'm going to watch it again at least 2 more times to make sure I remember everything that Louise shared. So thank you again so much, Louise.
Thank you, Eddie. Thanks for having me.
Can we do a cheers with a coconut as well?
Cheers.